there is a real concern here about this drift back to American isolationism that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And the American leadership on this has been so important. And how do we maintain that? I'm hopeful that it's not over, that we can rebuild it, but not going to be able to rely as much as we have been on the US leadership.
Welcome to Management Matters. I'm James-Christian Blockwood. In this episode, we're taking a step back to look at American governance through an international lens. As the U.S. grapples with complex challenges, from institutional trust and democratic resilience to administrative modernization, there's much to learn from how other nations approach public administration and governance reform. We're joined today by two distinguished scholars who bring global insight to these questions. Andrew Podger is a former Australian Public Service Commissioner and a leading expert on public sector reform and accountability. Alasdair Roberts is the former director of the University of Massachusetts Amherst School of Public Policy, an author whose work spans comparative governance, democratic institutions, and the future of public administration. Together, we'll explore what the U.S. can learn from international models, how governance systems evolve under pressure, and what it means to build a more resilient and responsive public sector in today's global context. Andrew, Alasdair, welcome to you both.
Hi. Thank you very much, James-Christian.
Okay, let's dive in and let's start with a broad view. From your perspectives, how does American governance compare to other democratic systems in terms of responsiveness, transparency, and institutional resilience? Andrew, maybe let's start with you.
Obviously, we've got quite significant differences in institutional frameworks. So the Australian, and Alasdair can talk about Canada as well, we've got some similarities in terms of parliamentary systems as against the presidential system. But notwithstanding those significant differences, there are a lot of shared principles, not only about a democratic process where the government is representing the people and there's a process of elections around that, but also about the checks and balances, about making sure that there are degrees of separation of powers so that to reflect those checks and balances. Also, the administration of government needs to be fair and impartial and inclusive. These things are expected. The administration must obviously be responsive to the elected government, but it's got some responsibilities directly to the citizens it serves. So those shared principles, I think, are very important.
And Alasdair, what are your thoughts?
Well, just off the top, I guess I would say, there's 193, 195 countries in the world. Most of them, if you were to look at the Fragile States Index, are ranked as fragile or extremely fragile. Most people on the planet live in countries that are ranked as fragile or worse. The United States isn't in that category. So actually, notwithstanding any concerns we might have about the challenges of the moment, it is the case that the U.S. is still a relatively stable, relatively high-performing system. So, there's certainly issues we need to talk about, but that's the sort of base case. There are signs of fragility, but it's still one of the better performing systems in the world.
So you're saying that the U.S. isn't quite seen as a fragile state, but there are certain conditions that might lead it that way. What are the types of things that we might see that would suggest that the U.S. is headed towards that state?
I think, there are signs of fragility. There are clear signs of fragility. The system is more fragile than it used to be a few years ago. The way I would frame it is to say, I put the United States in the same bucket as other very large polities like the EU, like India, China, sort of supersized political systems. And when I look at the American system today, the main thing I see are problems with the design and operation of central institutions. People sometimes talk about the American system being in crisis, and the point I make is that the American system of government is immense and complex. When you count all the units of government in the American system, according to the last census of governments, there's about 90,000 governments in the U.S. A lot of what we worry about when we're talking about problems of malperformance or controversies are institutions at the center, and I think it's important to keep that in perspective.
That's an important point that Alice is making. But another important point is that there's some problems of backsliding that go not just in America. This issue of backsliding is occurring in a lot of countries at the moment. And I don't just mean the more authoritarian countries like China, but a lot of other countries have had their problems in recent years. And there's quite a literature about this concern about backsliding.
The way that I view our constitutional republic is that we're a very resilient country. For almost 250 years, not that America doesn't have its faults and not that it has gotten everything right, but it has by and large delivered for the American people. But that doesn't mean it can't improve. And so as resilient as we are, what might you say are the most distinctive strengths, but also weaknesses of our current public administration model? And I like your framing, but I'd also like to kind of explore what those strengths and weaknesses might be based on that. And maybe Alasdair, you can start, and Andrew, welcome your comments as well.
My hypothesis is that the system is over-centralized, that the tendency in the American system over the last century has been to push more responsibility up to Washington, away from state governments. And that's vertical centralization, and in Washington to move more authority over to the presidency to create a stronger presidency. And it's important to note that both of those things were basically bipartisan projects over the last century. And I think the difficulty is that Washington, to some degree, has more than it can handle right now. A large amount of centralization was done on the premise that the country was more or less entirely on the same page about national objectives, about what government ought to do and what a good society looked like. And I think part of the difficulty right now is we've got, in a way, the worst of both worlds. You've got a very strong presidency, a very strong center, but you've got very strong differences about how central power ought to be used. And that's the sort of conundrum or difficulty that's being worked out at the moment.
I think there is an issue of over-centralization, but I'm not too sure that's a central concern. If I look at my own country, we've got a federal system, but for more than 50 years, the trend has been towards centralized involvement. While I think you can see pictures of over-centralization, some centralization has been inevitable. The concerns I have are more about within that centralized system, there are problems of the checks and balances. And one interesting issue happening in Washington is what is the role and responsibility of the legislature vis-a-vis the executive? That's quite a common issue in other countries. An argument here is the executive is too powerful and the checks and balances from the parliament are not strong enough. So that seems to me an issue that I would see as a concern. And related to those checks and balances is, of course, the clarification of the independence of the legal aspect of it.
In the U.S. system, the different branches of government serve that function to help check the other branches. How does that work in different international systems?
In the parliamentary system, the executive comes out of the legislature. The executive is determined by who has the control of the House of Representatives. Even though it comes out of the legislature, it is nonetheless accountable to that legislature. And the legislature has responsibility for what can be spent and what monies can be raised. So you've still got a separation of powers, even though the executive comes out of the legislature. It's just a different form, but in a way, it overcomes some of the problems of the presidential system. The presidential system, you've got an elected president who then appoints a series of secretaries of departments. And those secretaries have got administrative roles, but they're not elected. In our system, the ministers who are equivalent to your secretaries are all in themselves elected. They've got a sense of direct representation authority, and then they will have a civil service under them who can be apolitical. The American system, by definition, has got appointed people who are political. So in our system, we have a clearer separation of the politics and administration within the executive, but we have a rather blurred responsibilities between the executive and the legislature. It's not quite as separate as the American. So those are quite significant when it comes to the operations of the two systems.
And I would be an enthusiast of some sort of parliamentary model, a unicameral parliamentary model for state governments in the US. I know I'm dreaming when I say this, but I think there's an argument for it. The great virtue of the parliamentary model is said to be energy in the executive. It's the capacity to get things done. I would be opposed to the use of a parliamentary model in central government in the US because I just don't think it would fit the realities of the country. And having a very strong executive in a country this big might be kind of a recipe for a crisis, disaster, frankly.
We're talking a lot about politics at a systems level. What about the individual political leadership level? Obviously, in the U.S. context, you can have individuals that have outsized authority and influence. Does that happen in other international governance models?
I think the parliamentary system makes it much harder to have such a strong leader because the Prime Minister is not directly elected by all the Australian people. The Prime Minister is elected in a particular electorate and then must, within the party, become the leader of the party. So there are a lot more processes involved before they become a leader. So I think it's less likely to be quite as dominant as can occur in the US system. I think there are other factors about the way in which our political systems have operated. But one of our concerns at the moment, as I mentioned before, is that our parties are becoming, membership is becoming much narrower. And so to get pre-selection into the parliament in the major parties is becoming more problematic and concerning. It's not as clearly representative of the broader people because of that. So we have our own problems, but nonetheless, the structure tends not to lead to a very powerful single individual. But once they are the Prime Minister, the system, and I think it's partly to do with the media and a whole range of other things, senses that the Prime Minister is the centre of all power. And so the media focuses whenever the Prime Minister speaks, that's grabs all the headlines. It takes control. If you're a junior minister, you're unlikely to get too much attention.
But there's one human factor that's actually really important, which is in a parliamentary system, the Prime Minister has to show up in the House of Commons regularly, weekly, and answer questions and defend the record of the government, which is you have to be on your toes to do that competently. If you don't manage that process well, it can come back on you pretty quickly. So it's a sort of leveling process, I think, I would say.
Yeah, that's certainly one way to ensure you have trust in your leadership. I want to go to the polarization question that we mentioned earlier. Obviously, in the U.S. context, things are quite polarized, and that can lead to gridlock within different institutions. It arguably could lead to declining trust in institutions. How do other countries manage these challenges, and are there any lessons that can be applied here?
Our compulsory voting, where voting is both a right but a responsibility. And because it's compulsory voting, you don't have to pander so much to your own side. You have to work out how to get the votes from the centre. So it is an antidote in part to polarisation. But I hasten to say we still have had more polarisation in recent times, but that polarisation that's occurred is now starting to backfire because of our system. Our Conservative parties in the most recent election had moved to the right and pandering very much to their narrower membership base, but got beaten very dramatically in the election, particularly when there was within that party references that sounded a bit like what your President Trump was doing. And that did not work in Australia very well at all. And so the Conservative parties are now trying to work their way through how do they retain the support from their narrow membership, but still make sure that they are attractive to the centre. And our Conservative parties are struggling with that at the moment here.
So if we'd been having a conversation, I want to get my calendar right, a year ago, what would that be? Yeah, it's the fall of 2024. The standard line in Canada would be, yeah, there's a problem of polarization in Canada as well, that the two major parties, Liberals and Conservatives, are kind of drifting apart, that there was a sort of Trumpy vibe going on to the Conservative Party in the United States, the way it was reflecting the American style of contemporary style of conservative politics. And we would have said, yeah, polarization's an issue. So, polarization is less intense in Canada than it was a year ago. It's not anything that Canadians did. It's the problem of polarization in Canada was fixed by the American election and the inauguration of Donald Trump, which completely upended Canadian politics and pushed Canadian politics basically back toward the center. If we'd been talking last fall, a year ago, it would have been taken for granted that the Conservatives were going to win the next Canadian election in a walk. That got completely reversed after the inauguration of Donald Trump, and a centrist Liberal government Liberals got reelected, but they also moved quite substantially to the center. The Conservatives in Canada are sort of, I think, to some degree flummoxed about where to position themselves and where to go now. Who knows where we'll be a year or two now? Maybe this sort of politics of the moment will wear off, but unity concerns and sovereignty concerns have, for the moment, overwhelmed concerns about polarization in the Canadian context.
So we've been talking a lot about what the U.S. can learn from other countries' systems of government. And Alasdair, you talked a little bit about what other countries have responded to based on what they're seeing and observing in the U.S. context. But what lessons do you think some international governments have learned from the U.S.?
Just off the top, and then I'll turn over to Andrew. I mean, this has been generally recognized in Canada as a turning point in Canadian history. It's almost impossible to overstate the significance of the moment in terms of Canadian history. People recognize this is, to use the Prime Minister's language, a rupture, a historic moment, a turning point, a hinge moment. It's causing a broad recalibration of Canadian thinking about what their national strategy should be, not just their relations to the U.S., but how they think about their economic policy. And so it's basically driving a complete rethink of how people think about governing the country.
Pick up two aspects of this. First one is exactly like, as Alasdair is saying, that it's forcing us to reflect on our institutions. What are the things that are important for our arrangements? So there's a lot of discussion here about clarifying what's sometimes called integrity in government. What are the institutional arrangements that need to be strengthened again? So it's reflecting on what's happening in the United States, saying how can we avoid some of that tendency towards fragility? How do we rebuild our resilience arrangement? But the other one also, as Alice is saying, reflecting on our international arrangements. And like a lot of countries, probably more so than most, we have a real dilemma. For us, China is by far our most important trading partner, but the US is by far our most important strategic partner. And trying to work through how to handle that dilemma, we had been in dealing with China up until recent years, seen it as a win-win. The trade arrangements have been good for them, good for us, and indeed the possibility that trade with China might encourage them to do more opening up and reducing the Communist Party control arrangements. Sadly, we haven't seen that in recent years, and now we've got this dilemma with America trying to press us to be much firmer in our stance towards China. But China, nonetheless, is still by far our best trading partner. So that presents a dilemma. Nonetheless, in handling that dilemma, I think we and a lot of other countries are doing some things which are, in fact, sensible and should have been done some time ago. That is, accepting that we need to take a bit more responsibility ourselves for our own security and work with our other regional partners to develop security arrangements. So you see, for example, in Europe, a rethinking of what are their own responsibilities for their own security and their own regional frameworks for that. And for us, it's working with our immediate Asian partners, thinking about relations with Japan and India and others as not as an alternative to the US, but as saying that we need these things as well, and we need to accept a little bit more of responsibility for ourselves. So this issue of sovereignty has been, in a sense, a positive, but it's hard to work out exactly what the balance should be, and we're still struggling with it.
So I've been working in this field for about 35, 40 years now, and working with Americans for decades in the field of public administration. And if we'd been having a conversation in the 80s or 90s or even the early 2000s, Canadians talking to Americans and, folks from other countries as well, I think it would have been taken for granted that we had a shared interest in promoting governance that involved a deep commitment to democratic values and human rights. The common project was figuring out how to promote democratic governments that respected fundamental rights. That sense of shared mission is now, that I think it's gone. It's broken up. And that is deeply troubling for me. It is troubling for me because, I think one of the great challenges of this moment of history is precisely showing that democratic systems that are built on democratic principles, are capable of navigating all the challenges that we're going to be confronted with in the coming centuries. The real issue is what works better in turbulent times. Is it a democratic model, or is it the sort of Chinese authoritarian model? And this would be exactly the moment where you would like to see a sort of sense of solidarity and common purpose among democratic systems. And we don't have that. Watching the dynamics in the US, this isn't a partisan issue. It's folks on both ends of the political spectrum in the US, I think, have become more preoccupied with the internal dynamics of the American system, and they are disengaging from this sort of broader international concern about promoting democratic governance around the world.
Can I strongly support what Alice is saying on that? There is a real concern here about this drift back to American isolationism that we haven't seen since the Second World War. And the American leadership on this has been so important. And how do we maintain that? I'm hopeful that it's not over, that we can rebuild it, but not going to be able to rely as much as we have been on the US leadership. And it's also the other action internationally by the US in recent times, which is adding to that unease, has been the trade issues and the issue around the tariffs, which is upsetting friends such as in our country or Japan or Canada or Korea, but it's also alienating people who could easily become close friends like India. And it's giving comfort to those countries that are more authoritarian. So I think that this is adding it to this undermining of this leadership and push for Western liberalism and democratic processes. And like Alasdair, I believe that one of the strengths of those processes is that they are more likely to be able to resolve some of the tensions internationally and the big global issues we've got. You need those sorts of flexibilities and frameworks that liberalism and democratic arrangements offer.
My last question to you both. I believe very strongly the world will always need U.S. leadership. I believe our country is incredibly resilient, and I trust the American people to vote in their individual interest and what's best for their communities. However, many are questioning the American system of government at this time, given how fraught it is. What is your inspirational message to the American people about our system of government and what opportunities lie ahead? And maybe Alasdair, will start with you, and Andrew will end with your message of hope.
I think my take would be, remember that the American system is immense, and it's got lots of parts, and a lot of the parts are working fine. The town of Amherst, where I'm situated right now, is run on democratic principles, and it's got its pros and cons, but it's working fine. State government in Massachusetts is not in crisis. No one's worried about it tipping into crisis. It's moving along as it always does. It's not perfect. It could be reformed, but there are lots, and as I said, there are thousands of elements of government in the American system that are just clicking along well, where people can participate and make a constructive contribution. A lot of what we're talking about when we're talking about challenges to governance is the design and operation of central institutions, but that's only one part of a very big system.
I guess I would add to that just a reminder of the contribution American democracy has made internationally and the ideas that came out of the American Revolution that have inspired other countries and still inspire other countries, and just be proud of that history. Yes, it's got some, like all of us, it's had its bad times and good times, but the idea of America, I think that's still a real international strength in my view.
I'm going to make a pitch for a book I wrote many years ago called Four Crises of American Democracy. And I basically said, this is not exactly new terrain for the U.S. There are periods where the system sort of tips into a period of malaise and conflict. And the argument I made is, it happened in the 1970s, happened in the 1930s, happened in the 1910s. And very often this is sort of the way the system works when it's reconfiguring itself. It's a very painful process of redesign. That might be what we're going through right now. It's incidentally the 50th anniversary of a report from the Trilateral Commission called The Crisis of Democracy, or The Crisis of American Democracy, I think. Go back and look at the dire statements that people were making about the condition of the country back in 1974, 75, 76. And things seem pretty bleak, but tempus fugit, time moves on.
Lots of lessons to be learned about the American system of government, yet lots to be proud of as well. We've talked about shared principles around checks and balances, representation of the people, and separations of power. We've just heard really good insights around the challenges and opportunities of the American system of governance. And I want to thank Alasdair Roberts and Andrew Podger for their comments.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks. It's been wonderful talking with you.
Management Matters is a presentation of the National Academy of Public Administration, produced by Lizzie, Alwan, and Matt Hampton, and edited by Matt Hampton.